This video is a short presentation about the software architecture pattern MVC. MVC stands for Model View Controller, and you may ask yourself, why do we need this architectural pattern? And this picture depicts very well that we sometimes can run into trouble when we develop software. So we need to have a good way of organizing our code, not only the code but also the platforms the code is run on. The multi-tier architecture as we know it, the typical 3-tier model where you have the data tier and the logic tier and the presentation tier. Usually we use this model to separate the three platforms: the presentation, which would be the user interface; the logic, where we have the all what is happening about the business model; and then we have the data tier, which is typical the database processing. And this multi-tier architecture model is a way to show how it is connected network-wise. That means typically we have three platforms or three different areas where you can connect with a network. For example, a user interface is connected to a server with the logic tier, and then we have the data tier on a separate server where you have to connect with another network. If we look at the web application development, then the presentation tier would be the browser, and then we will have a server of some kind, application server, and then we will have a database server. And the technologies that run on these platforms would be HTML, CSS, JAVASCRIPT in the browser, and in the server we will have PHP, .NET, or Node.js, or whatever it may be. And then in the data tier we will have the database technology. That could be MySQL, SQL Server from Microsoft, or MongoDB, or another NoSQL database. The MVC architecture can be visualized as this. We get a request from the user, and the request goes to the controller. The controller is the mind master of the architecture. It is here we make all our decisions of where do we need to go to fetch some data and update the view. The controller executes a method or some code in the model, and the model will then connect to the database and retrieve some data, which can be returned to the controller, and the controller can then push this data into the view as a response to the user. So this is one way of looking at the MVC design pattern. Some other technologies will view it differently. What is most important about the MVC pattern is the separation of concerns, which is a principle we use in all kind of areas in software development. Let's see of a typical example of separation of concerns. We have, for example, the front end. We have HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which we like to separate. We don't want to put CSS into our HTML, as in we don't want to make inline styling or embedded styling in our HTML, and likewise we don't want to put inline JavaScript in our HTML. And when we want to modify our DOM with JavaScript, typically we use CSS classes. So we have the structure, and we have the layout, and we have the functionality, and we try to separate those three areas in the front end. And this goes also for our application when we're talking about MVC. Here's some variations, some other illustrations, and this is the illustration from Microsoft.NET MVC, where we can see that the controller can connect the model and can push something to some data to the view. But opposite my my illustration before, the view is also able to connect to the model, and it's another way of looking at MVC. I would prefer that the responsibility of what the view is going to do relies in the controller. That means it's the controller that pushes data into the view. Some may say that the view is stupid. It cannot do anything, it cannot think, it cannot do anything than receive data from the controller and then push itself out to the user. So this is another way of looking at MVC, and there are lots of different variations as you may find when you go and look at the internet. Here's another one from Wikipedia, where the user uses the controller to manipulate the model, and the model will then update the view and then push itself to the user. And that's a different view on the MVC design pattern. I would again argument that that the view itself should be controlled by the controller. So it's only the controller that communicates with the model, and the controller communicates with the view. CODEIGNITER, the PHP framework, uses this approach as I'm talking about, that the browser connects with the controller, the web server, and routes the requests, and then it connects to the model, and the model will connect with the MySQL and then return something, probably data, back again, and the controller would then connect with the view, and the view will expose itself to the controller, and the controller can then push the view out to the browser again. So there are different ways of looking at MVC and different implementations. When we look at front-end MVC frameworks, it could be something like Angular from Google. Then we have the view, which is the HTML. It's like a template in the HTML where we can use the Angular tags to fill in the data and some functionality as well. And then in the model, in this case, we have some JSON in our model. It could be that this model is updated from a server via Ajax, but it could also be that it's made with PHP. And then we have the controller. The controller is pure JavaScript, which will function as the decision maker. When we're talking about front-end development, it usually is the case that the view sends, or the user triggers an event, and this event will go to the controller, and the controller will then update the model. Perhaps it would like to request something from the model, or perhaps it would like to edit, delete, or create. And then the model will send some data back to the controller, which can then update the view, and the DOM. So the user sees this update as a result from the event. Another way of looking at the MVC in JavaScript in front end would be that the view sends a user action, and the controller then updates the model, and the model will then notify the controller that now the model is updated, and then the controller will update the view. The controller, as I said a few times, is the decision maker. It receives the request, and in parentheses I wrote takes care of query strings and RESTful architecture. If it's like a PHP or .NET or Node MVC, that means it's at the server. Of course, if it's in the front end, it will not take care of query strings, it will take care of events happening. And then the controller has the responsibility to update the model, that means execute methods in the model, and receive data from the model, so it is possible to push these data to the view and then present the view to the user. And if there's a front end, it will just push the data to the view, and then the view is at the user interface. The model will reflect the data model. That means if we, for example, in PHP have some data classes or some classes which reflects the tables in the database, then in the model we will have some classes where it's possible to, for example, create, read, update, and delete in our tables. So it receives requests from the controller and enables these updates in the CRUD, create, read, update, delete. And it communicates, of course, with the database server or where the data is located. And then it returns the data, the updated data or the requested data, to the controller. The view is a template. It's a template that the user sees, and it has some placeholders for where to put in the data that the controller has retrieved from the model. So it receives the data from the controller, and then when the data is passed and markup is ready, the view is sent to the user, and sometimes it's already happened in the front end, or when the view is passed, then it is and notification is sent back to the controller, and the controller then, for example, includes or sends out this view to the user. If you want to read more, and of course you would like to do that, I have 4 links here for some interesting articles. The first one is Separation of Concerns, where you can read more about the principles of separation between technologies, platforms, and then a little bit about the differences between MVC and 3-tier pattern, and then of course Model View Controller on Wikipedia, and then this article about app frameworks, that means JavaScript frameworks